All right. Thank you for joining us this evening, especially here in the holidays. We're going to be having Steve up here in a minute to talk to us about Edgar Cayce on righteousness versus sin. One thing I always like to try to do as a preface to that is to give an anecdote just out of my own life, if I can, as far as an example of the kind of subject matter that we are dealing with here. And I remember back in a rather trying time in our lives, it was around the late 80s, and I had, without going into a long story, it wound up in a legal problem with another gentleman who was being very unreasonable, even by a court's decision in which I prevailed against this gentleman in court. And he wound up just causing these legal bills to mount and mount and mount, and caused me to actually have to go to a court with a jury trial, so that the expenses were incredible for this, minor thing that was going on. Anyway, here I am after the trial is over, and I wind up prevailing, and I get a $20,000 judgment against the guy, but I have to write a $5,000 check to my attorney in order to pay him for, taking me through the trial. And this is where I got to have a real experience with righteousness versus sin, because it has everything to do with your motivations. And I got this incredible idea. What I was going to do was take that $20,000 judgment and just sign it over to my attorney in lieu of having to write him a $5,000 check. Now, he's getting 4 times the amount of money, and by the way, attorneys know how to get money out of people. And he could have, he just turned it over to a secretary or a paralegal, and they'll just follow into whatever job he gets next and garnish their wages and make sure he gets his money paid to him eventually. So I thought, I have got 2 birds with 1 stone here. One, I don't have to spend another dime on trying to, get this whole thing resolved. And at the same time, he is going to have this pit bull of an attorney going after him instead of me having to go after him and, get all this angst up in me. So I thought I'd really hit the promised land on this. Well, about 3 months later, I go over for another matter talking to the attorney. I said, by the way, you haven't any luck collecting that $20,000 judgment? And he goes, no, funny story about that. He goes, you remember I told you that I thought that I knew the guy from somewhere else? I said, yeah. And he goes, well, it turns out he and I belong to the same ward. They're Mormons. Mormons do not sue each other. And so he was telling me right there, I just had to write the whole thing off and let it go because I wasn't going to sue a fellow Mormon. And right there, everything just unfolded to me. He says, the thing that I had was a righteous or a non-selfish approach to assigning the $20,000 to the attorney because it got me out of harm's way without having to go after the guy and be all upset and thinking about it over and over again over all the time it would take to get that. And that was a good motivation. The bad motivation was, I got a pit bull on you now, and he's going to be after you forever and ever, and that's a good thing. Well, it wasn't a good thing. And that was how come I was given, what would you call it in golf, a mulligan? God was giving me a mulligan saying, you got to just see the righteousness come out of this, and you didn't have to pay the $5,000. And I'm showing you that he didn't wind up having the pit bull come after him because you really needed to learn the lesson that you should not rejoice in the iniquity of others, as the Bible puts it. So that I shouldn't have been out there going, I need to give you your comeuppance. So it's like, oh, God, that was a pretty sneaky one. You think you're all high and mighty. Oh, wait, he is high and mighty, so he can get away with all that stuff, right? But I was able to learn the lesson of what is the difference. It's the same action, but it had to do with a dual intention of righteousness versus sin in there. The righteousness, I didn't have to pay the $5,000. The sin was thinking, I got a pit bull after this guy, and I got the lesson in a very clear way to where I never wanted to do that again. So to be able to get into all of the details of what Edgar Cayce had to say on righteousness versus sin, please welcome Mr. Steve Bobbitt.
Hey. Well, that's going to be a hard act to follow. Thank you, sir. I only focused on the tail end of the matter here most of my life. Not really sure how to follow up with that, but we will certainly try with sin versus righteousness. As always, these presentations are done with the intent of providing you my insight as to what I interpret the Cayce readings to say regarding this topic. This is the beginning of what's called Book 3. Book 3 is very, very thin. There's only a couple of chapters in it, and it's rarer than hen's teeth when you're trying to find one in print. So this would be the beginning one, and next month I'll be doing the one on man's relationship to man, which is the next to final chapter in it. But everything in here is going to come out of the Cayce readings on this topic. These are my interpretations thereof. And as always, I find good nuggets for me to take away when I do things such as this. These are very, very enlightening. And as always, I encourage anybody who wants to do this to undertake this, because it's a wonderful learning experience. It really is. I cannot state how much this has personally helped me in my spiritual journey here. Righteousness versus sin. Boy, we see a lot of that today, don't we? Everybody's up in arms about all kinds of different things, and what's righteous to some is sin to others, and vice versa, and that's pretty much what Cayce says, and it's a matter of us trying to put it all into perspective for us. And what we'll start off with here is the reading for this: to study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman not ashamed. This is the underlying theme that will be woven throughout this presentation. And it ties right into ourselves standing up and doing God's work and not to be ashamed of doing it. It may sound quite simple on the surface, but it is a rather precarious situation down here 3 rocks from the sun, because we live in a material world where there's a lot of prevailing values, attitudes, and beliefs, not to mention our personal emotions and psyches and the egos and whatnot, but not very easy to always do that. And we have a lot of lessons available to us. So one of the things that I really want to start out with, and this is going to set the tone for it, is from the Oxford Living Dictionaries. I've defined what they term righteousness and sin. So righteousness is the quality of being morally right or justifiable. To whom? It doesn't say to whom. But to whom does righteousness being morally right? Who is morally right or justifiable? Therein lies the problem. Sin, on the other hand, we have a couple of definitions for sin. An immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. Considered by whom? Who considers that? The second one is an act regarded as a serious or regrettable fault, offense, or omission. An act regarded by whom? Ourselves, others, man's law, God's law. To whom is laying forth the judgment? And this is what we are needing to set up, because Cayce certainly sets the stage starting right now. And in 262, 126, it says, for each soul, each entity, each conscious awareness of an individual is the combination or the composite of all the entity has thought or done in consciousness of every sphere or phase of activity. This is really interesting, because what this is going to tell us is that our personal interpretations of right or wrong go past our personal lives, because of anything that has happened in previous lifetimes. If it's relevant to our growth in this lifetime, it will be carried forward, and it will become part of us at this time. Consequently, we may not know what these tendencies are, why we do things. I mean, there's times in my life that I have said or done something and then immediately stopped and said, what in the hell did I do that for? I had no idea. It just popped out. And in hindsight, it kind of gives us an idea of what was going on. It goes a lot back. And it's part of karma also. Because Cayce tells us that anything that we do that is against God's law must be met. We have to meet it. And we have to meet it in the same plane that it occurred. Which means down here, 3 rocks from the sun. Okay? And all of this builds up into us, and we come in here, and these tendencies are being brought forward for our edification, because these are going to turn into becoming opportunities for us. Because a lot of times the tendencies that we have may or may not necessarily be happy ones. But we do something for a reason, and we have to think about it and get a grip on ourselves. But we are learning when we do this. And this is also a prevailing thought throughout here. But whenever we find things that just seem to come out of left field, perhaps they have their origins in a previous lifetime. We never know for certain, but we cannot discount that. Again, from the 126 readings, for righteousness and sin, as in the minds of most individuals, are the extremes of an awareness in the consciousness of an individual. Thus, it becomes a personal condition to be reckoned with by the individual. Whoa. Phrased differently, righteousness and sin are unique to each of us. We have each captured the market on righteousness and sin because we have our own interpretations thereof it. In case he says it might be at the extremes of our consciousness. But we don't think about it those ways. But it's each and every one of us. Again, these are tendencies that are seen to be coming out. And we have these past lifetimes where we're coming in and we're having input or influences that are being brought forward with us from lifetime to lifetime. And then, understanding that these are the formative, then what do we have? We have societal values. We have familial values, personal relationships, ethnic cultures. All of these things go in to form our values, attitudes, and beliefs and define who we are. This becomes our personal background information. We all have background information. We all know certain things. We act different ways. But it's based on the input that we have received over the years that we've been alive, running around on this rock. And when you think about these things, and you can see that there is a karmic relationship oftentimes because these are being brought forward from previous lifetimes, it gives you an opportunity to think about maybe there is an alternate explanation for why certain things have happened in our lifetimes. The Old Testament is riddled with battles where the Jewish folks leaving Egypt met other tribes of people and they did battle. We have Jericho and places like that in the Bible. Okay? Moses was always opening up the can of whoop-up. Right? But now think about this. Think about this. And this was just a thought that I had at 4 o'clock one morning when I was sitting down doing this stuff. Moses did, with the folks, he led them into a lot of battles. Now, we'll talk about this in a little bit later, but did Moses really, was he following what God told him to do? Did God tell him to go out and kill these people? Or did Moses just interpret that and use that? He heard God's words and then decided upon the method. And doing physical battle perhaps was the way. So, if we think about this and we have influences and we understand the karmic relationships of things, Could it be possible, do you think, that Adolf Hitler was one of the people that Moses did battle with, that the Jews did battle with once upon a time? Could that be a plausible explanation of what happened in the 30s and 40s? We don't often think about it because it's such a, atrocious event, but when you look at the Bible and you look at how many people were actually killed, it comes in. And Cayce talks about how these things do come back in full circle because they have to be met on our lines. One of the things is with Elijah. Now, if you remember, Elijah and Jezebel were arch enemies. Jezebel had her high priest that she wanted to use, and they did battle with Elijah. And they had a face-off and whatnot. And when Elijah had won, what did Elijah do? He killed 400 of her priests, right? You know what it says? Fast forward a couple hundred years, and we have John the Baptist. Now, Cayce tells us that John the Baptist was Elijah reincarnated. How did he meet his fate? Well, he was busy visiting the king, let's just say. And the king had a niece. And the king said, "Niece, what would you like for a present? I'll give you anything you want." And what did she say? "Bring me John the Baptist's head on a platter." Now the king couldn't back down because he was sitting there running his alligator, and now he had to accommodate that. Well, Cayce tells us that the niece was Jezebel, reincarnated. So when the give and take of these things, when it comes back, we got to recognize that, he may have been doing what he thought was righteous by whacking these people, but is it God's way? Is it really, truly God's way? Did he say, go kill these people? Or did he say, you need to quash this, but you need to do it in a right way? If we believe that we are the offspring of an all-loving and knowing God, then why would he say, go kill our fellow man? I don't think that's in his vocabulary. I think it was a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation, so to speak. But when we start seeing these things, we kind of got to think about this. Because this also turns into our judgment, because in history can be a very cruel animal. And it may not always apply the things that were going on. It may not know everything. We all learned about the Holocaust, and certainly it was not a good thing. And did it happen because Hitler and his band of groups were evil people? Well, they certainly weren't being very loving. And if we do, in fact, travel in soul groups, then the people that were in and around Hitler were probably with him in previous battles, perhaps. I'm not trying to justify the actions, but I'm just trying to lay out an alternate explanation for your consideration. Something to think about in case you run out of things to worry about. And see, this is why I do the Cayce stuff, because these things comes out of left field. Where did that come from? Wow. So, to further the explanation on righteousness versus sin, let's look at the case studies. We have a couple of folks that we want to look at throughout the Bible. The Bible was very useful in this deals. And we can talk about some of the lessons that we learned with Abraham and Isaac. And we'll talk about our friend the Pharisee. And then the Apostle Paul, or the disciple. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles, but he had his, let's just say, come to Jesus on the road to Damascus and got his act together. Sin versus righteousness is a very, very awesome there. So, Old Testament, Isaac and Abraham. Isaac was the kid, okay? And this is also an interesting thought, because in the Bible we're telling that for many, many years, Sarah was unable to produce an offspring, try as they might. And they were getting up there in years. And when finally, what happened? A messenger appeared saying, guess what? You have news. And what did she do? She kind of laughed at him, didn't she? Well, you know what Isaac means according to Cayce? Laughed at. Because she met herself right there. She was laughing at it. Said, the angel tells her, okay, you're pregnant. She just goes to laughing. And then lo and behold, here's Johnny, or in this case, Isaac. All right? So it was in there, and it was very, very interesting. So, in Genesis 22:2, we can say that, and he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. In other words, go off your kid. Now think about how that would be received when he went home and said, guess what I did, honey? It really wasn't a good situation, and it was very, very hard. And the problem with this, and the way I look at this, and I really don't know of in my mind exactly when the timeline would have been, because I'm not sure Cayce talked about when, as man counts time, the Garden of Eden would have happened, etc. I'm not aware of that. It's possibly there. But one of the things I do believe is that when we came forth as the Adamic man, that our tethers to the Almighty were a lot better shape than they are today. We were able to be in more of spiritual contact with God at that point because we were not that far away from our fall, so to speak. Consequently, we were more in tune to listening to God than we would be today. My personal view of this is that the longer we went on, the further we got away from God. And then we just finally crashed into the bottom, and then here comes now Jesus to come back in, and now we're climbing the way back up because we had finally seen the light. But in here, this is what God told Isaac to do. And there's a lot of lessons in here because what was he doing? He was saying, okay, I want you to go, I want you to offer your son to me. Well, did not God do the same? Did he not bring forth Jesus and say, hey, man, this is it? But what happened? What did God do? God stayed Abraham's hand, did he not? And instead of taking the life of Isaac, what did he do? He presented a lamb. What is the lamb? Symbolic of his son, Jesus. So we were starting to see how this came across. And the other thing about it is that fast forward to the time of Jesus, man had the opportunity to stay his hand, but he failed to do so. Consequently, we had to shed the blood. But Jesus was good with it. Why? Because he put his whole trust and faith into the Father. He accepted it. And the readings tell us that he laughed on the way to Calvary. And that he was cracking jokes. Because he knew he had the bigger perspective. He was able to put himself up. He knew that all he had to do is just finish this journey right here. And it would be, as his final words would say, it is done. And that's what he did. And the problem that we have as humans is that we forget God's promises. We don't think that they apply. Well, that happened thousands of years ago. They're not germane anymore. I would argue that they're every bit as germane, if not more, today than they were back then. because we have the opportunities to put our faith and trust in him as well, if we choose to do so. And therein lies the problem. Now, the other part of it, Cayce tells us that when this drama was playing out, Isaac was 21 years old. He was an adult. He was a man. He could have looked at Abraham and said, dude, what's up? What's with this? But he didn't. He didn't do that. He accepted it. And he, too, gave of himself, never questioning about that. He could have rebelled, but he didn't. Jesus could have rebelled too, but he didn't. A lot of parallels with this. Continuing with the Abraham and Isaac story, for as may be illustrated, to the work-a-day mind of today, Abram's offering of Isaac would appear foolish. Yet, as stated, it counted to him as righteousness, not sin. He believed that his interpretation of what God said was for him to go in there and do it. Yes, he would have been taking another human life, the life of somebody he dearly loved. But his marching orders came from a higher authority. And he did not question them. He just did it. He did God's work. That's what God said to do. That's what he went to do. Now, if we were put in like positions, we would have a lot of issues with this. The mind would go to thinking. Perhaps Moses too had his words in there. Maybe his mind went to thinking, well, this is the best way to approach the situation. We'll just go in there. We have the numbers, right? Let's go do it. But again, this is the justification. It counted to Abram as righteousness. Why? Because it came from God, and he knew that he had that connection with God, and he was going to do what God said. Okay? And he went all the way through up to the point of about to culminate the action when God stayed his hand. He was going to do it. He was no doubt, because that's what God said to do. And he was good with that outcome. Sarah, probably not so much, but minor detail. Now, this came out of Cayce's Bible school notes, which is pretty interesting. That's a very interesting read, because he takes the Bible and talks about this is how he was teaching in some of the Bible school study notes that he had. And in it, it says, from this experience, we see that the true relationship to God is the willingness to withhold nothing from him. To listen to the voice of God and hearken, rather than giving away to the dictates of our personal feelings. This is what is meant by the fear of God. The fear not to do what God has told us to do. We perhaps use it a little bit more liberally, but to fear God in him. But this is what Cayce said it means, is not to do what God has said to do. And this is where we come into it. And what we are trying to do with this is, the lesson is we've got to overcome ourselves. And a lot of times we'll go to thinking about it. And we're not going to heed this because it just doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, it's an unpleasant thing for me to have to do and think about. So therefore, I am not going to do that. Okay? And that's how we operate in our rational minds. We run the logic test on it. And when we do that, then oftentimes we fail to heed God's work because it doesn't make sense to us. However, ego is not our amigo. We've got to understand that it is to be quashed. We have to if we truly believe it, if we have the connection with the Lord deep within, we should know that it's our pleasure to do God's work and not rationalize what it would mean to the outside world. And oftentimes we as human beings in this day and age tend to not do things simply because we have fear of what other people might think of that, or they might say, they might write nasty things about us on Facebook. You see? And we don't do that. We're afraid of the criticism, even when the criticism results from us doing God's work, which should be what we want to do. And we're seeing all these material standards that we have set for ourselves, and oftentimes, and if you really think about using Jesus as a pattern, he wasn't really interested in getting ahead materially, right? He wasn't always bucking for the promotion or driving around in his Beamer or anything, you know. But this is how we have been trained to act. And for me personally, I believe that it's simply for a lack of a moral compass that one chooses to approach. Because it comes down into all about the I, me, my versus the we. Everything that Jesus did was for the we, not the me. He wasn't self-serving in a lot of ways. Didn't really care about it. And when we think about it on the broader spectrum, we have to realize that we are all going to be tested. We all have things to prove down here, not to each other, but to God. We're all not going to be tested in the same way. We're all going to be tested differently. And perhaps, when we are being tested, we are being asked to unconditionally give to God as he unconditionally gives to us. Will we choose to heed those words? I don't know. And the other thing is that where it starts to come into the sin versus righteousness deal is perhaps other people who are being tested are playing things out in their lives as they best see fit. And there's a slight possibility that we just might not agree with that. But they're trying to do it too. You know? And if you take the broader perspective of what Cayce said, we are all down here to reestablish our relationship with God because we have fallen away from it. This is what we're here to do. We're trying to reestablish everything. Get with the program. He has willed that no soul shall perish. But the only thing separating us from God is us. It's a choice. And this is the rub because this is the balance. We are in a material society. We need to balance man's law and God's law. Not always easy because we have a premium on it because it's important to put outward impressions on us. Our buddy the Pharisee. This is where we talk about in Matthew, talks about the Pharisee who went to the temple and made a great big show about his praying. Very interesting. And one of the other things is not being the sharpest tool in the shed. I had to figure out what the Pharisees were and what the pecking order was back there. So, in case I'm not the only one who has no clue what these people are, the Pharisees were primarily middle-class businessmen. They were considered the fathers of modern Judaism. They rejected Hellenism, the Greeks. They didn't like the Greek influence. They believed in the oral law that God gave Moses. That was what their driving points were. They had a focus on individual prayer and synagogue gatherings. Thus our buddy the Pharisee. On the other hand, we had the Sadducees. This is the aristocracy, very wealthy and powerful people of their time. They rejected the oral law in lieu of the written law, which is the Torah. Okay? The Torah gave them their marching orders, and that's what they chose to abide by. They were willing to cooperate and work with the Greeks. They had a focus on temple rituals. Then we have the Sanhedrin. This is the ruling council. Think about Congress. Think about Congress. And think about these guys as Democrats, Republicans. The Sadducees were the majority, and the Pharisees were the minority. Okay, and they would go in there and they would dictate how the Jewish people would live in cooperation with the friends, the Romans, who were running the show at the time. And that's kind of the pecking order there. Now, Cayce's in the Gospel of Luke, to refresh your minds, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. That be you. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And when he's doing this, he's being very oral about this. He's being very vocal. Make sure everybody understands that he's a just man here, you see. It's important to set the stage. So, coming in out of the readings, the 125s, it was given, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, ye shall all likewise perish. Here, says Cayce, we find the presentation of righteousness in varying degrees. Else it could not have been referred to as even a type or condition of righteousness. Now, some of the old Bibles, especially out of the King James Version, are kind of hard to read. The "except your righteousness" is an archaic phrase that you can substitute the word with perhaps until. Until your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you shall likewise perish. The other part of it is that, what does that mean, ye shall all likewise perish? Cayce tells us that in this context here, the word perish simply means sin. You're going to sin. And think about in the terms here now, what happens when we sin? We got more things to do. We're retarding our growth here. Consequently, we're going to have to meet ourselves, and this is where we're getting into troubles. The Pharisee was quite vocal about who he was, and he wanted everybody to know about this because it was important, because as a Pharisee and not a publican, they needed to make sure that they know this. Do we see this in our society today in any way, shape, or form, do you think? I think a polite way might be saying tooting one's own horn. Right? And this is kind of what this guy was doing. He was in there making a spectacle of himself. All right? Now, the righteousness of the Pharisee was that is indicated by the prayer offered in the temple. That he thanked God he was not like other people. Here we find then self-righteousness, not condemned, and yet except your righteousness exceed that of the self-righteous, ye shall all likewise perish. And what Cayce is saying here is that he's talking about judgmentalism. Are we going to be judging others? Now, when you think about and look into what the Pharisee was talking about, he wasn't condemning the folks for being extortioners or adulterers or unjust peeps. He was just calling out their attributes and making sure that everybody knew that he wasn't like that. He wasn't like that. The self-righteousness was the problem that the Pharisee guys had. And what he's trying to do is elevate himself in a forum so that everybody gets it. Cayce actually tells us in another reading that when the Pharisee did this, he was looking for, he got his reward, by the way, for this prayer. His prayer was heard. And he was rewarded for it. The reward, Cayce said, was that people were in awe of his righteousness. So for him, he wanted to make sure they got the message. They got the message. God didn't. God wasn't impressed. Because what was he doing? He's tooting his own horn. And that's where he was elevating himself above others. He was saying that he is better than extortioners and adulterers and unjust type of people. And he did it in such a form that he was comparing himself not only to others, but also the publican. I'm like the publican. I'm like this man over here. I'm somebody special. How many times have you seen or heard news, or even in TV shows, you see all these stars up there, and they'll go up to the airport or something, and there's going to be a little bit of a discombobulation, and they go, "Do you know who I am?" Y'all remember seeing that? Yeah, that's exactly what's happening on. This is basically what our friend the Pharisee dude was doing here. Okay. Thus we have the direct manner in which each individual might judge. Not as judging another, but as an analysis, a looking within, as to whether there were the promptings of the life, the spoken word, the activities, by self's desire, self-indulgence, self-aggrandizement, self-laudation, self-praise, self-activities, without respect to the fellow man. This is key, because this here is the lesson that Cayce is putting forth to us. And what he's saying is that we are going to, when we come around, we're going to be in the surroundings where we see this happen. We have in our life the Pharisee playing out every day with us. And Cayce's saying, don't be judgmental, but rather use that as an analysis. And when you see this, ask him. It's not so much who is saying it, but what is being said. And do we, in any way, shape, or form, have similar actions? It's quite possible that we do. And if we do, then we have room for improvement. But it's, again, Cayce would be saying, criticize the act, not the actor. Because there is lessons here for us. If we see people doing this, we should stop and ask it, okay, this is in my environment for a reason. Is there something for me to learn here? Am I doing this? Do I have tendencies to do similar things? And then, how am I doing it? The other part of it is, what is being said? How does that frame other people? In what light? Now let's use one of his evil people that he was talking about, that he didn't do it. He was, let's just say, the adulterer. I am not an adulterer. What was he inferring? Was he inferring perhaps that adulterers in general are bad people? And does one act, the act of adultery, make the person? Or is there more to the composition of that individual than a fleeting moment? But yet when we see people who, no pun intended, get caught with their pants down, how do we judge on them? That just came to mind. How do we judge them? Do we judge their whole life based on one action? Are we judging the act? And this is what Cayce says. Don't be attacking the person. Rather, attack the act. Look at the act and reflect upon it. Is this something that I may have done? And if so, how can I do better? Is it affecting another person? Am I degrading another person by saying these words? And these comes in for us, how it relates to the other people. Then we are able to measure ourselves better. When we start bettering ourselves, then we're going to stop doing the things that we may be doing. People say that the road of spiritual development is not easy, and that's a true statement, because what we are doing is we're trying to learn to control ourselves and conquer ourselves. I mean, we can get dogs to run around on their hind legs. We can have birds fly and land on our hands, but we have a hell of a time trying to control ourselves. And this is what it's all about, is we're trying to control ourselves. When we go down the spiritual path, we find, or we come into our little world upstairs between the ears of the things that we can improve on. And the saying is that, the more you become involved in your spiritual development, the harder it becomes. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I don't believe that it's physically harder with respect to it, but what happens is this. The more you do this, and the more I do this, I'm taking another layer of the onion and peeling it back. I'm finding things that I can do better. And I have to add it to my list of things to do now. I believe that's where it gets harder, is because now you're more aware of how flawed you really are. And we all might think that we're just perfect little beings. Just ask us, we'll tell you that. But when you start getting in here and really digging down into these readings and you start peeling back the onion, you can find that there's a lot of room for improvement. And you got to bring it into your personal awareness, because if it's in your personal awareness, then you can take action on it. The lesson here is just one of those things that we may choose to think about. Now, are we living that life that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisee, who gave his tithes, who attended to the offices of his position, who met regularly in those capacities for the activity of guidance, teaching, and directing of others? Yet, what lacked he? Did he teach the letter of the law and forget the spirit of the same? You see, the Pharisee wasn't a bad guy, because he did do all these things. He was a very good man. He did tithe, as he said. He met in his office. He tried to help others. He did all the things. He was just a blowhard. All right? And that's what we're seeing here. He was teaching people what they needed to do, but yet he forgot the spirit of it, meaning, hey, it's a two-way street. You've got to live it. And this is what Cayce always talks about in his search for God, when he was giving pointers, so to speak, to the Norfolk Study Group #1 who wrote The Search for God. He was always encouraging them to put in personal stories, like the anecdote that John gave to kick this off. Because it's in these types of things that, hey, you know what? I did this. It has a lot more meaning to those who may be seeking, because now you have something to think about. You have something to think about, and you can walk the talk because you've been to town, seen the elephant, And it means that to more people, because you're putting it forward, you're actually living it. And it's so key to be able to live it, because that speaks volumes. Cayce was actually told in one of his readings that his actions speak louder than his words. And it was the things that he was doing and the way he did those things. Not necessarily the readings themselves, but his personal interaction with folks that was entirely very, very meaningful to a lot of folks at a lot of different levels. Very important to think about. But this is a good thing for others. And this comes right back down to looking at somebody and saying, okay, are we going to judge their whole life by a single event? Perhaps not. There then may be a lesson here gained by each. That sin versus righteousness is that sin, which is separation from God, and righteousness is adhering to, making at one-ment with God's purposes, even as indicated in the prayer of the publican, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That last quote right there is the first recorded episode of the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. Right there. God be merciful to me, a sinner. That's the KISS principle. Because you know what? That is all we needed. That's all our buddy the Pharisee needed to do. He didn't need to go off on a tangent here. Let everybody know how cool he was. That right there is the way it's done. That is so cool. That is a very, very good thing about this. We have two sets of rules here on earth. We have man's law and we have God's law. Man's law, in many ways, is fabricated after God's law. But the significant difference between them is in the application of the law. There is much more variance in how the laws are applied when it comes to man's law. But the key thing to remember is that God's law is fair, it's even, and it's full encompassing. And God doesn't care, A, how much money you got, what your lot in life is, or any of this other stuff. He wants to know, are you at one-ment with Him? Are you separating yourself from God with your thoughts, words, and deeds? Or are you adhering to and making God's purposes alive in your life? So God doesn't judge. He doesn't judge each individual. Well, you know, he did good job tithing there, so I'm going to cut him some slack here. Don't work that way. Everybody is under the same rod. And we're all on it together. And a lot of people kind of take advantage of those things. But it comes down to our personal interpretation of how we're going to apply those. And most importantly, what is important to us as individuals. Because it's up to each of us independently and individually to pursue our personal spiritual path. And the fellow next door just may not agree with the way we're going about it. But we have to be good with following our own intuitive selves as opposed to worrying about trying to keep up with the Joneses. All right? Okay, we're going to talk right here with our buddy Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. Very key to his existence was the fact that he held dual citizenship. He was both Jewish and Roman. And he used that to his advantage in his life. He was a well-to-do Pharisee. He had very firm convictions and a fiery temper. He persecuted the early Christians, which is an interesting story. And he had his awareness elevated on the road to Damascus when he was blinded by the light. And half of the Bible's New Testament books are attributed to Paul. because here was a major shift in what he was doing as he was going on. Cayce talks about Paul, and he goes, in that pronouncement of Paul, I did in all good consciousness persecute the church. This to him was sin, yet according to the consciousness, righteous sinning. This was the old Jewish side. He was a Pharisee. He didn't like this New Age stuff coming around. People were going on board and kind of going off and deviating from established Judaism, and he did not like that in any way, shape, or form. Consequently, he took it upon himself to become quite vocal and persecuted those who were practicing this new mindset. And in his mind, what he did, the ends justified the means, because he was hardcore and he wanted to make sure that by hook or crook, people are going to do that which they said they were wanting to do. Now, a very interesting thing about this in his early life was that an early promoter of Christianity was Stephen. And Stephen ran afoul of the powers that be in the time. One of them happened to be Paul. And Paul was very adamant and actually campaigned to get Stephen stoned to death. And that actually did occur. Fast forward several years, and now we find Paul getting stoned. And what Cayce said was quite interesting. He did not die of the stoning, but by the same token, he never threw a stone at Stephen. He got the troops all wound up, but he did not cast the stone. Thus, he did not contribute to his death. Thus, karma, he was able to meet karma right then and there, because somehow when he was running afoul of the folks and he found himself up to his neck in hot water, he didn't die either from it. So he was able to meet that karmic reaction because he was promoting, hey, we need to stone this guy. Well, be careful what you wish for. And that's one of the things that come out. And I want to correct that. I don't believe that's a Cayce statement. I believe that's part of the some interpretation in the Bible that's where that came from. I don't think Cayce said that. But that was a very, very interesting thing. And it's, again, instant karma, practically. And when we start seeing about these things, and when we become passionate about what we view as sin and righteousness, we've got to kind of rein in our thoughts and deeds and saying, okay, what are we doing here? And are we allowing folks to express their inner selves, or are we busy saying, no, you cannot do that? And to what degree do we then take it forward? This is what Paul did. He was very, very adamant that this new upbringing in religion was totally against God's law. Consequently, he thought what he did was right. He wanted to protect status quo. For as may be drawn from the experience of those who have been, who are, who may be called into service, if there is the sincerity towards the ideal, they as individuals will be shown, will perceive, will be awakened, will be aware of God's purposes with them. This is what happened on the road to Damascus. Paul was very, very adamant about this. He was passionate about this. But he was just kind of taking the wrong approach. He had the fire in his gut to go in and really work on this. He could become a very moving force, and that's exactly what he did right here is a lesson for all of us. Sincerity towards the ideal. What is our ideal? How sincere are we? Think about chapters 2 and 3 of Search for God. Know thyself and what is thy ideal? What's your passion? And then how are you going to apply it in your life? This is what we're doing here. And this is what Cayce is to do it. We need to define and then live that. That's what the ideal is. It's not just an idea. It's something that you live. How are we going to define it mentally, spiritually, and physically? That's what the ideal is. And then we need to pursue it and take it forward, because then, once we do this, once we decide that this is the way we want to go and we take ownership of it, you'll be shown more. This is where the awakening occurs. And it's very, very easy to think about, how are you going to do this? What am I going to do that would be beneficial, not just to me, but to others? And that's the litmus test for all of this. If you ever sit down to do, an ideal, think about, what am I doing? How do I want to act? And is it for me? Or is it designed to be of benefit to another? Because if you serve your fellow man, you are serving God. Many ways to do that. Just, find it. But you got to have it up here. And then you got to start living it. And that's cool. And then you go sue. And then you can become every bit as, with all your vim and vigor going after it. Because as soon as Paul got his awakening, he was every bit as adamant for the church as he used to be against it. He did a 180. He flipped it right then. He reversed course. Because of that meeting on the road to Damascus that he had. And he was very, very good about it. He was very, very strong supporter of it. So much so that this is where he ran afoul of the ruling bodies in there. And once he started to get sideways with the Jewish folks, he had to defer to his Roman citizenship. Because now he was elevating using his stature, using his birthright to keep himself alive and to perpetuate this. And he went all the way back to Rome, and I think it was when Nero was running the show, who was the man at that time. But it's very interesting that we start seeing these types of things, and it comes down to, what is your ideal? And this is what Cayce said happened. For when he was aware of his error, through the call to service, he became as active in the defense of that as he had persecuted in all good consciousness. Do we bust people's chops for changing their mind? Some people are very, very passionate about a certain course in life. And then suddenly, out of the blue, they're now doing something different that was they used to do. I don't think that's an uncommon trait amongst us humans. I think it's something that we all may do. We may find that there's a better way of doing something. And we can apply this lesson, because that's exactly what happens. He was able to make a decision, and then he acted on it. And it's so key that we are willing to step up and act on that which we believe. Right, wrong, or indifferent. I was on cruisers in the Navy, and one of the things that we used to do, we used to have to do submarine exercises. Well, there's no way in hell we'll get a submarine. I guarantee you, we're 700-foot cruiser chasing a submarine. They can hear us coming 25 miles away, for God's sakes, we're so big. But we had to go out and do it. And once you picked up something, it came down to right, wrong, or indifferent. Do something, because you know what? There might be a torpedo coming. You start hearing hydrophone effects, you have issues. But you got to take action. You got to do something. Even if you're not necessarily, you don't perceive that you're equipped to it. And you do it. You got to do these things. And this is the lesson right here from Cayce on this. It says, to be sure, this is an approach only from the individual standpoint, the individual's activity, but considered in the light of those influences of statements which we have made here, that one had best be active and in error than not doing anything at all. In other words, get off the couch and quit playing with your toes and do something. Even if you're doing something wrong, as Paul was, he was active, he was doing it. He had now what? Room for improvement. He was very passionate about persecuting the early Christians. But then he had a change of heart somehow through divine intervention. And then he became just as passionate about protecting the church and putting forth the values of that as he had been persecuting it. And this is what Cayce says to all of us. Every day that we live, we have opportunities to do things. But it's very important to us that we at least try to do something. We may not know what we're going to do. A lot of us are quite hesitant in what we do because, well, it might not be right. Who cares? Try it. Do something. Don't just sit there and play with your toes. Get out there and do something. You got to try. And if you're passionate about it, and if you're making an honest effort, if the intent is there, as John alluded to, you'll be shown the lessons that you need. And then you too get to peel back another layer of the onion. And go in there and say, okay, I can do this. And the fact that we don't take action on a lot of things comes straight down to the root cause of not having an ideal. Do something. I mean, Cayce said that your ideal could be centered in the spiritual, it could be in the physical. And if your ideal is set in the physical where you're trying to, just money is your God. You want to do everything just for money. Go after it. Cayce says, get after it. Because there will become a time where you'll be shown. It doesn't mean you're always going to be that way. You won't always be that way. Things are going to change. Life has a way of interfering with the best laid plans of mice and men. And remember, God wants us back. Consequently, we're going to have our own journey down the road to Damascus. In some way, shape, or form, we're going to be shown, hey, you know what? Here's a better way of doing things. And we're always going to have an opportunity to change, so long as we put forth the effort of doing it. And again, it just comes down. Are my words, thoughts, and deeds designed to benefit me alone or to help another? And if you take that and doing the sharing with others, if that's your intent, if that's your deal, you will be shown. You'll be shown the way. You'll find how to pull it off. You may not think in your rational mind that you have the wherewithal to do something, but if you put forth the intent and you get up there and try, I guarantee you, you're going to be surprised what the hell happens. Because I do it every day when I stand up in front of a class. Because it ain't me, baby. It ain't me. It's coming from somebody else. I'm just a mouthpiece. And I specifically ask for that help because I know in and of myself I am incapable. And I admit that. And I seek help and guidance. And it works. So what about today? Have we any opportunities in our own little world these days to become judgmental, become righteous about things, certain causes, or consider other causes sin? What about abortion? People are quite passionate about that. Interracial marriage, becoming a lot more mainstream these days, but 100 years ago and going forward, and actually up until probably the last 20 or 30 years, it was no, don't do that. What about immigration? What about guns? Free speech, it's under attack. What about premarital sex? All of these things are opportunities for people to draw the line on and say, okay, in the extremes of my consciousness, is this righteousness or is this sin? And people individually will have a say-so on that. Perhaps some are going to be more passionate that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. But how are they going to go in and approach that? But these are things that we're faced with every day. We hear about them every day. And these are opportunities for us. Perhaps some of us in this room are quite adamant about one way or the other on these things. Okay, nothing wrong with that. But we got to understand how it works and how we are going to need to try to keep that into perspective. And I'm going to finish this up with 3 very good readings from the Cayce readings that are every bit as germane here. First one comes out of 3063:1. This is the first lesson ye should learn. There is so much good in the worst of us, and so much bad in the best of us, it doesn't behoove any of us to speak evil of the rest of us. This is a universal law, and until one begins to make application of same, one may not go very far in spiritual soul development. We talked about this. We talked about judging the character of a person on a single act. We're all flawed beings. If we weren't flawed, we probably wouldn't be here. But we are. But we're not alone. We have a lot of good company. When you look at somebody and you see them, do you look at them in the light of how they're dressed and their fashion statements that they're making, or how they're speaking or smelling or looking to you? Or do you consider them just to be another soul trying to find their relationship with God, trying to express in their own personal path? As humans, we're quite judgmental. We have tendencies of being that way. But if we think about it from a spiritual context, we are all Israel. We are all seekers. We are all searching for God. The fact that some people are going certain ways doesn't mean anything. This is what they're trying to do. They're expressing their inner selves. Who are we to say that that's the wrong way? They got their path just as we have our path. We got to really, really think about this. This is one of the ones that filed away upstairs for me. As indicated by him, there is none righteous save the Father. Thus all righteousness is bound in the attempt of individuals to make application of that in the material as termed good. And yet good appears in varied forms to man's consciousness. Phrased differently, what we see as being good versus bad is a personal opinion. What may be good to me, you may perceive as bad, and vice versa. None righteous save the Father. Well, that makes sense. And if we're trying to do His work, then perhaps we are exceeding the Pharisees' righteousness. Perhaps we're doing His work because we're not being judgmental towards others. We're not elevating ourselves at the benefit or at the cost to another individual. All of this is coming down to that we have got to understand that it's upstairs is where righteousness and sin is defined. And it's how we perceive it. Then it becomes a question, what are we going to do about it? That too is a choice. Strongest force in the universe is human free will. So much so that even God doesn't know what we're going to do next. So we got to think about this and say, okay, how can I try to at least emulate the Christ? He is the pattern. Think about how He conducted Himself. He was in situations that were not very pleasant. How did He deal with that? What lessons can we take along ourselves and apply that? When people get in your grill and start talking about, how you're this or that, you may have to kind of bite your tongue sometimes. How did Jesus do it? He didn't get upset. He didn't cuss them out. He didn't put the woo-woo on them or anything. He talked to them. And this one would probably be a damn good one for every person on this rock to know about. Remember, others think also. They have the right of their opinion. There is a way that is right, as in the purpose of the Lord. We may not necessarily agree with what they have to say or how they pursue things, but they have the right to it. They're expressing their inner selves. They are trying to find their path. And think about it in this light. If somebody says or does something or has an opposing view to that which you may hold near and dear, could it be an opportunity for you to find and follow the purposes of the Lord in your approach towards that and how you choose to meet that? Everything is an opportunity. We have oodles and oodles of opportunities every day. We just need to frame them and look at them in these terms. Having the ideal will help us go that way. That's about it. That's about it.